It came to light that Deutsche Bank had willfully decided to ignore suspicious activity reports, SARS, with regard to the president and his son-in-law. What is your plan to hold Deutsche Bank responsible for failing to do appropriate oversight and respond to the regulatory controls that are in place with regard to SARS?
Well, let me just say the SAR issue I did read in the paper. I am going to have FinCEN follow up and make sure that Deutsche Bank, as anyone else, has SARS policies that are on everyone.
Member of the House Committee on Financial Services, Democratic Congresswoman Katie Porter of California, questioning Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin yesterday. And Congresswoman Porter joins us now. Welcome back. Thanks for coming back. So much to talk about. First of all, let's just put a period at the end of the sentence with Ben Carson, who was actually questioning your credibility and your ability to do the job and know the issues. To that, you say what?
I think Mr. Carson is attempting to fix what was a hearing that went terribly awry. I was incredibly disappointed both in his preparation for the hearing and the answers he gave, not just to me, but to my other colleagues. And now what I'd like him to do, instead of getting defensive and hurling accusations at me, I'd like him to double down on doing his job, studying what's going on with the FHA, the low and moderate income and first-time homebuyer program. The facts are, which Mr. Carson still has mixed up, that FHA has the most common outcome of an FHA loan is that it goes to foreclosure REO status. So it's not true that foreclosures are rare at FHA. They're actually higher than at other similar agencies. He also said yesterday or day before, when he's saying that I don't know what I'm talking about, he said when FHA loans go to foreclosure, that they are sold very quickly. When point in fact, clearly demonstrated by industry data, is that FHA loans that go to foreclosure take nearly 2 years to return to our housing market, during which time they become blighted and are not available into the supply of affordable housing. These are the facts. This is what I want Mr. Carson to grapple with on behalf of American homeowners and on behalf of American taxpayers.
So perhaps do your homework or resign, because we got big problems for American homeowners in this country. Moving on to Secretary Mnuchin, from your testimony, from his testimony that you heard yesterday, and as it pertains to the president's tax returns, his financial records from Deutsche Bank, and Mnuchin's position on them. Do you think he works for the president or for the American people? I'm not saying what he should do. What do you think he's doing?
I think in the hearing, he did demonstrate, he doubled down very clearly that he had not relied on any conversations with the president, with the White House, or with others outside of the Treasury Department and the Department of Justice in reaching his decision not to provide the tax returns, which, in my opinion, lawfully must be provided. So I think he attempted to demonstrate independence in the hearing. He was pressed on this several times, including by Chairwoman Waters, given an opportunity to clarify his remarks. So he appears to be trying to say this is my independent decision, have zero doubt. And unfortunately, I wouldn't want to be in Mr. Mnuchin's shoes right now, because his decision and his interpretation of the tax law and the rule that requires the disclosure of tax returns here is just simply dead wrong.
Congresswoman Porter, yesterday you indicated, quite accurately, many people think, that you didn't think Secretary Carson was up to doing the job that he holds. So I'd like to ask you a question about the job that he holds and about its impact on specific citizens in this country. In this case, we'll start with your district in Orange County and in LA County, where I'm told by friends of mine who live out there that they often have a 2 to 3 hour commute back and forth to work for lack of affordable housing in both Orange County and LA County. What's the status of the federal government's position and movement in the Department of Housing and Urban Development in building more affordable housing, not just out in your district, but throughout the country where it's vital?
So this is a fabulous question. There is an affordable housing crisis definitely in Southern California and a lot of parts of coastal California, but increasingly around the country. And that's a good sign. That means that our economy is growing, that we have people able to buy houses, but it also means that the supply doesn't keep up. We have both a rental affordability crisis and we have a home ownership crisis. And the reality is that the Housing and Urban Development Department has done very, very little to address either of these things under Secretary Carson. To the contrary, what we've seen is he's increased rents for those in public housing. He showed zero understanding of the magnitude of the low-income rental affordability crisis. My colleague Nydia Velasquez asked him how many people are on the wait list for low-income housing vouchers to help them subsidize housing. He said a couple 100,000. The answer she correctly gave is 4.4 million. So this is an issue that affects millions of Americans, and it affects everybody, because when a low-income family is pressed into a housing they can't afford, that's one less dollar they have available to take care of their children, to put in their retirement account, and to become self-sufficient and stable.
Congresswoman, hey, it's John Heilemann here. I want to ask you a last question, going back to Secretary Mnuchin. The president yesterday used the phrase the I word with respect to himself, and there's now, among a lot of your colleagues, discussion about whether, for instance, the Attorney General should be impeached. Secretary Mnuchin is now getting some of that kind of scrutiny, too, because of his refusal to turn over the president's tax returns, as the law clearly states he should. Do you think that there is going to be a movement? I know Congressman Swalwell and some others are talking about Mnuchin as someone who needs to be impeached. Do you think that is a legitimate position for the Democratic Party to take with respect to the Treasury Secretary?
Congress is a deliberative body, and we move in a deliberative way. And I think Secretary Mnuchin's appearance and the fact that he answered every question that was put to him, I think should give us confidence that we should give a little more opportunity for this to play out. It doesn't mean we shouldn't hold him 100% accountable for following the law. He, in my opinion, and the opinion of every other reasoned lawyer that I know, he is refusing to comply with a lawful requirement that the Secretary of the Treasury shall provide tax returns, period, full stop. You cannot read any excuses into that. And his assertion that executive privilege may apply or does apply to that situation is completely incorrect. Executive privilege applies only to advice, to deliberative materials. It's about how to protect people as they make decisions. Tax returns are not about deliberation. They are final documents, and they must be provided under that statute. Right. I personally would like to give Mr. Mnuchin a little bit more opportunity to comply with the law. But if he doesn't, then we'll have to figure out what to do next, including taking him to court.
Congresswoman Katie Porter, thank you very much for everything that you do. Still ahead, Senate Majority Leader Steny Hoyer is standing by. He'll join us live to talk about the president's Rose Garden meltdown yesterday. It was all planned out. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.